Less than 100 miles from the United States of America, Cuba is close, but it is time, not distance, that makes the island nation seem so far away.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
Now, after a half-century of hostility, Cuba and the U.S. are reconciling their differences and forming a new relationship.
One that's based on trust and mutual collaboration.
One that could build a bridge between two governments, two economies.
The embargo is taking its toll.
Even two old friends.
She says he has to come back. She wants him to come back so she can reminisce.
It will take a new understanding, a new approach. It will take change in the U.S. and inside Cuba. Good evening, I'm Leyla Santiago, reporting from Cuba, a country 90 miles from the United States, one strongly defined by its politics for nearly 60 years. Now, Cuba is slowly changing as it improves its relationship with the United States. I have found many here who are hopeful for a better future. Over the next half hour, we'll take you inside Cuba, introduce you to Cuba as it is today, its people, its culture, its way of life. We'll also explore the opportunities not only for the people here, but also for the people of the United States, including North Carolina. This is Cuba Today. Home to 11 million people, Cuba is an island where music can be heard any time of day. It is an island filled with patriotism and people who sing and dance, no matter the circumstances.
If you don't have hope, you don't have anything.
Known for its fine cigars and natural beauty, it is also an island with one of the highest literacy rates of the world, a free education system, and a free healthcare system with an abundance of health providers like Osmani Garzón.
Porque sin el sistema de salud no hay nada. Por eso es muy importante, como el estudio, como el agua que tomamos, es muy importante.
The Cuban government provides food rations.
Enséñame a mí. These are their ration cards.
Every Cuban typically gets rice, black beans, sugar, poultry, coffee, cooking oil. Antonio Ponce tells me the portions are not enough to feed himself or his two sons for an entire month.
Una isla rodeada de agua. Y en Cuba en este año han dado pescado un solo viaje en la carnicería.
Juan Rodriguez says life in Cuba is hard.
Es durísimo. Aquí los salarios son muy bajos.
The average Cuban will make about $15 a month. A teacher will make about $25 a month. A doctor, $40. Many struggle to supplement the earnings for the rest of their needs. Enma Negret depends on money sent from her niece in Vegas. Even so, her refrigerator has a small pack of meat and water. That's it. This is good, she tells me. Normal. Many blame the lack of resources and current living conditions on the U.S. embargo put in place in 1962.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
The embargo halted any trade with Cuba as an effort to combat communism. Communism came with the rise of the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro, who eventually became an ally of the Soviet Union. And when President John F. Kennedy learned the USSR placed nuclear missiles on the island.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
Yo tenía apenas 10 años.
Anthropologist Ernesto Valdez was 10 years old during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Porque todos nuestros padres, tíos, hermanos mayores fueron movilizados. El país se movilizó completo, se puso en zafarrancho de combate, ¿no? Y eso nos asustaba y nos sentíamos bastante confundidos, ¿no?
Confused and filled with fear on the island, just like many in the U.S., fear of war at any minute.
Lo creíamos. Lo creíamos, en todas las casas había un fusil, algo muy feo, y sentíamos temor y al mismo tiempo sí teníamos el deseo de mantener la independencia de Cuba, porque lo que Cuba quería era ser independiente simplemente.
Cuba maintained its independence. Now in power, Fidel Castro's brother, Raul. The tense relationship with the United States has remained intact for years, and that has come at a cost. Its now crumbling infrastructure and old cars are constant reminders of what once was in Cuba and its reality today. Coming up, we'll introduce you to a man and a woman, both born in Havana, raised on the exact same street. One stayed in Cuba, the other ended up in Morrisville, North Carolina. Their stories next on Inside Cuba. In the early 1960s, thousands fled the island, seeking a life outside the communist country. Now, there are more than 2 million Cubans in the United States, 11 million here on the island. Less than an hour's flight away, their lives are drastically different. In Morrisville, North Carolina, Carmen's Cuban Cafe serves the food that reminds owner Alfonso Sama of his childhood.
I don't want to tell you the secret.
Every morning, this is where you'll find him, in the kitchen, cooking Cuban cuisine, just like his mother Carmen taught him.
I thank God for everything. I have a beautiful kids, I have grandsons already and everything. I cannot ask for more, really. It's where I used to live with my mother.
He was born in Cuba, and he liked it there once.
It was fine until Fidel Castro came in.
He says he spoke out against the government and ended up in jail.
I think like the communists, it was very restricted. They want you to do what they want you to do.
And so he decided to leave in a raft.
Days in the water, a lot of days in the water.
He started a new life in the U.S., but has never forgotten about Cuba.
The stories my dad would tell me growing up, he just seeing his eyes just light up about the beaches and the mountains and different areas he's been to, it just excites me to want to see that.
Alfonso's son Ali wants to visit Cuba with his dad. It's a place he hasn't seen in 53 years, not because he can't.
My dad has mixed feelings about going back.
No fear, but reluctant.
Reluctant. So we went for him.
Right now, we're trying to go find out where Fonzie worked.
And I used to work in H. Uman. In those days, H. Uman used to be the best cigars.
So this is it. There's a sign up there that says H. Upman, and so that shows that's where he used to work. Let's go find out what it is now.
Today, it is a school named after a leader of the Cuban Revolution. The cigar factory was moved to another building where we were introduced to 2 longtime employees.
Yo soy Leyla, y yo soy del Canal 5 de Carolina del Norte.
This is Adela Rebollo and Rita Salas. Rita says his name sounds familiar.
Alfonso Sama.
Sí.
¿Sí?
As for what has changed since they all worked together,
Los formatos de los tabacos.
she says the cigars themselves, their measurements and varieties. I tell them Alfonso now owns his own Cuban restaurant.
Ya tienes un restaurante cubano y todo.
And on a map drawn by Alfonso, they show me they still live in the same area where he once lived.
According to this map, it looks like one of these would be his home. And we have found somebody who lived here back in the day, so we're going to go talk to them, see if they remember him. So she doesn't know the family, and she doesn't remember him at all. So we're still trying to find someone who maybe is a little bit older and remembers them.
We're told possibly a woman named
Luisa!
but she doesn't remember either. When we realized Caridad Martinez does remember, we called Alfonso to connect them for the first time in decades.
Yeah, she says he has to come back. She wants him to come back so she can reminisce with him.
Caridad is living a much different life. she became a chemist, married, and lived in Canada briefly before returning to Cuba to care for her grandfather. When she told her father she wanted to move to the U.S. like others in their family, she has lost touch with family members in the U.S. At 69, she lives alone in the very house where she was born, not far from Alfonso's old home.
En este edificio. El verdecito. El verdecito.
Yo creo mucho en Dios. During the toughest of times here in Cuba, she has found herself turning to faith. And if ever she needs strength, she looks for the cross at the top of the Catholic church that can be seen from her home. The same church in Alfonso's old pictures. Pictures of what they both called...
That's where I used to live, right here.
The good times. Times and things have changed in Cuba. President Raul Castro and President Barack Obama have restored diplomatic relations. Coming up on Inside Cuba, what that means for trade between the two countries and what North Carolina leaders are doing to make sure their products land right here.
It's about reconciling our differences, and that process is going to take some time because we've had half a century of miscommunication or no communication at all.
Late last year, after months of secret meetings, negotiations, President Obama and Castro announced an agreement to normalize relations between their two countries. Now many see a new market here for their products, including a delegation from North Carolina. Cuba's rich soil and tropical weather are what many consider ideal in the world of agriculture. The town of Viñales is known for its tobacco. Oreste Diaz comes from a long line of Cuban tobacco farmers. His farm produces about 35,000 pounds a year. Most farmers here are part of a state-owned cooperative system. Farmers are obligated to sell most of their tobacco to the government, typically keeping about 10% for their own use. It's estimated that about 60% of the land in Cuba could be cultivated.
It's somewhat concerning that you see this richer soil and not productive, or not productive to its capacity.
Some see this as an opportunity. Take North Carolina, for example. A delegation of agriculture leaders traveled to Cuba to explore trade opportunities. Among them, North Carolina Farm Bureau President Larry Wooten.
The private sector is a little more profitable than the state-owned cooperatives.
He's been to Cuba before, so has Peter Daniel. And as he makes his way around the island, he has taken note.
The embargo is taking its toll.
He came with the North Carolina Farm Bureau in 2000. That's when it became legal in the U.S. to sell agriculture products to Cuba for cash.
The infrastructure has crumbled since then. But I'm seeing the restaurants and the privately owned small businesses, entrepreneurs, I'm seeing those develop.
This delegation understands that the tours and the meetings alone will not be enough to improve trade relations. It'll take an actual connection and understanding of the Cuban people. Dr. Armando Nova is an agriculture economist at the University of Havana.
Profesores, agricultores, agribusiness están muy interesados en todo este tipo de relación que me parece que es muy magnífica, ¿no?
North Carolina exports poultry and apples to Cuba. Now, this group wants to know what else could be mutually beneficial.
They've had relationships for 50 years with countries, Russia, Brazil, China, Canada, the European Union. And they're not going to just turn away those relationships because the United States comes calling.
Paul Johnson of the U.S. Agriculture Coalition for Cuba says something else must change if the U.S. wants to compete for more trade opportunities with Cuba. He believes relationships must be mended and the embargo has to go.
You know, other countries are offering credit and we can't because of the restrictions.
The embargo's restrictions were strengthened in 1996 in what's known as the Helms-Burton Act. It was sponsored in part by former Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina. It calls for an international embargo and requires an act of Congress to lift the sanctions.
The delegations are important because it gives us a chance to bring in different states, farmers, farm groups, agribusiness to Cuba, to have the exchanges at that state level and the farmer to farmer level.
As he sees it, it's an opportunity to put people before politics, something farmers are known to do. North Carolina, not alone. There is great interest on what could be for the island. Coming up, what's next for Cuba? To learn more about how the embargo impacts you and where lawmakers stand on the issue, go to WRAL.com and search Inside Cuba. You'll also find what you need to know if you want to plan a trip to Cuba. The desire for change can be found on both sides, from farmers, investors, Cuban families in the U.S., to the government and the people right here inside Cuba. Much has already changed in Cuba since both countries announced a new relationship.
Yo nunca pensé que fuera posible que yo iba a ver otra vez la bandera americana izada en la embajada.
The U.S. Embassy opened its doors in Cuba in August.
No sirve para vivir.
Pope Francis spoke directly to Cuba, calling for service and religious freedom.
Change in this moment, I believe in that. I believe in that.
When something isn't working, we can and will change.
The U.S. is calling for more change. President Obama wants more internet access for Cubans. In recent months, the Cuban government has set up Wi-Fi hotspots in parts of Havana. For the first time, Cubans are now gaining access to the world online.
Hey! What's up, man? Look at this.
They gather in these areas to reconnect with family members in the United States.
That's our family in Hollywood, Florida.
For some, this is the first opportunity to actually see the friends and family members that left Cuba decades ago. These new opportunities could change life in Cuba.
So this would be a common place for the tourists?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's getting popular?
The future could include more American tourists on the island.
And this is carbonating calcium.
Ariel Negrin is a tour guide with Havana Holdings Company.
And we are already booked till December 31.
They have seen about a 50% increase in requests for tours. As for who is booking,
every day we are more and more, receiving more and more Americans. And in the future, I guess it's an avalanche. It's coming.
It could come if restrictions are lifted. If restrictions are lifted, the United States could have access to lung cancer vaccines and highly effective drugs for diabetes developed on the island. But there is opposition.
Our current president has made no such effort to stand on the side of freedom. He has been quick to deal with the oppressors, but slow to deal with the oppressed. And his excuses are paper thin.
Many in the Cuban American community have expressed concerns over political prisoners, human rights, freedom of speech on the island.
The notion that the Cuban people will be allowed freedom of speech and freedom of information now that President Obama has made concessions to the very government denying them these rights is complete fiction.
Even if it is a new day in the relationship between Cuba and the United States, there is more work to be done on both ends. More change would be needed to one day expand trade relations, more change to have Wi-Fi access in every home, more change to one day make Alfonso Sama feel comfortable walking the streets of the island where he was born.
When they change, really change, then yeah, because Cuba is not free yet.
Maybe one day we could all see a new Cuba. It's difficult to predict exactly what's ahead for the people of Cuba. In the nearly 2 weeks that we've been here, we have seen change taking place in parts of the island, and we have certainly heard the hopes the dreams of the people of Cuba, many wanting change, real change that could redefine Cuba. In Havana, I'm Leyla Santiago, and I thank you for joining us inside Cuba.